18 different nationalities here today. And there are at least 3 countries that I am a citizen of those countries. So the United Kingdom, I think there is a Guyanese in the room, and of course, there are many Kenyans. You are in a place it's called Upper Hill. And Upper Hill is one of the CBDs, one of the central business districts of Kenya. And you can see the big shiny buildings. But actually, just about 10 minutes drive from here, we have the southern bypass. And adjacent to that bypass is an area called Kibera. And in Kibera you find rows of tightly squeezed, tin-roofed shacks that speak to the reality that millions of Kenyans live in today. And that picture from Nairobi's southern bypass also demonstrates graphically the inequality that exists in the city and sadly throughout our nation, our continent, and the globe. According to Oxfam, the richest 10% of people in Kenya earned an average which was 23 times more than the poorest 10%. What is even more distressing from Oxfam's annual study is that a girl from a poor family in Kenya has a 1 in 250 chance of continuing her studies beyond secondary education. And the picture is almost the same right across the continent. The latest edition of Time magazine points a picture of inequality in South Africa that should attract everyone's attention. Time reports that the World Bank last year deemed South Africa the world's most unequal society, estimating that the top 10% owned 70% of the nation's assets, and that was back in 2015. The Times story further tells us that the societal split is still largely along racial lines. The bottom 60% is largely composed of black, mixed-race people, and Asians who descended from the era of slavery and colonial rule. This bottom 60% controls only 7% of the country's net wealth, and half of the South African population live on less than $5 a day. Ladies and gentlemen, the inequality problems that we face today is not only limited to Africa. As a matter of fact, it's the norm on the global arena. I recently came back from Seattle in Washington State, and to quickly bring this into perspective, Washington State plays home to the headquarters of Microsoft and Starbucks, and is also the home of Boeing, the largest private employer in the state. Washington's state tax system has the dubious distinction, according to some analysts, of being America's most regressive tax regime. Reports compiled by independent analysts shows that poor residents in the state pay 16.8% of family income, while the wealthiest 1%, and let me be clear, these are the wealthiest people in the world, the wealthiest 1% pays 2.4% of their income. The same situation plays out in San Francisco, where there's immense income per capita, but it's virtually impossible to live there because it's so expensive. These statistics, whether out of Nairobi, Johannesburg, or Seattle, are pointing to a grim and a growing reality that the number of economically disenfranchised people is growing rapidly right around the world. And yes, this worsening state of affairs, the growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, is playing in many of the areas where our businesses are thriving and where you and I live. The reality is that our global economy today is broken. Hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty while huge rewards go to those at the very top. Many reports show that there are more billionaires than ever before, and their fortunes have grown at record levels. And meanwhile, the world's poorest are getting poorer. Ladies and gentlemen, this state of affairs is not sustainable. Over the long term, business cannot succeed where societies are failing. And the reality is that the existing model of business is not generating enough value to contribute to societal good. As our African economies focus on their growth trajectory from lower to middle-income countries, the question is whether our nations should pursue GDP-driven economic growth or growth that aims to bridge these inequalities. We may ask ourselves, why does this matter to business? Now more than ever, there's a clear call to action to business, that the business of business is no longer business. The Sustainable Development Goals, the call for more private sector innovation, and the call for businesses to develop products and services that address societal needs has been a constant topic in business leadership discussions. You'll hear more from Mark and other speakers through the next 2 days of this summit about the changing role of business and of business leaders. Issues such as climate change, inequalities, and rights are increasingly becoming fundamental issues that we will have to tackle as the private sector if we're to succeed in the long term. The truth is, no other sector, private, public, or NGO, has the capacity to address the fundamental business and social challenges that we face today. And that is why collaborative and inclusive approaches to business and cross-sectoral partnerships are critical. But this has to be looked at from a business lens for it to make sense over the long term. Ladies and gentlemen, increased inequalities lead to social, political ills, such as increased dissatisfaction, disengagement, migration, sectionalism, clanism, tribalism, and xenophobia, something which is all too true in South Africa today. If not addressed, inequalities will ultimately create a political and a business landscape that will be difficult to reverse. And we see that in the United States today. We see it with the mess that's called Brexit in Britain. Inequalities drive people to engagement in nefarious activities such as trafficking and slavery. The BBC reported not too long ago that there are about 4 to 5 million people living in slavery-type situations around the world today. Let's be clear, that's more slaves than existed before slavery was abolished. Faced with this global challenge of inequality, what should businesses do? I want to propose 4 approaches. The first is we must adopt an inclusive business approach. Let's seriously think about how to create employment for young people, how we can do business with more women-led organizations, and the same for the SME segment. Secondly, we must address corruption. Corruption is a challenge in our country, on the continent, and globally. It's often executed with the concurrence of the private sector. We are the other side of that coin. This scourge, which causes significant hemorrhage to the economy, drives inefficiencies, drives up prices, widens inequality, and deprives governments of revenues that should be used to deliver services. Thirdly, we must be responsible and transparent taxpayers. And I speak as the CEO for the company that's the largest taxpayer in the region. In the last year, we paid to the government of Kenya 98 billion shillings. That's almost $1 billion. And we're proud. Because we believe that it's only by providing an efficient tax net, and it's only by us as the private sector taking a responsible approach to paying taxes, that governments are able to provide the services that they are elected to provide. And finally, we have to tackle inequalities in the workplace. As businesses grow, we also need to self-examine how pertinent business questions, such as how we're performing on gender pay gaps, gaps between executive salaries and median salaries, especially now with more transparencies around wealth declarations. I can see my friend and brother, Joshua Igara, and we often sit and muse at the first time we announced publicly, voluntarily, our earnings and the ridicule that we faced amongst corporate Kenya. Now, of course, it's obligatory. The next thing we have to start declaring is that pay gap. Today, I believe CEOs around the world, the multiple is about 230, the CEO earns about 237% of the median salary. Is that the right thing? I mean, I speak because I know that my multiple is not the same here in Kenya. But do I earn enough money? Of course I earn enough money. But we have to look at that pay gap. We have to look at the gender pay gap. We have to look at the executive salary and remuneration relative to the median salary. We have to look at pay gaps along racial lines. There's no one sector can do any of this alone, but we have to commit to do our part. The public sector needs to set the enabling environment, while those of us in the private sector need to drive delivery of products and services that will transform society for the better. And civil society has to provide the links to communities and to support accountability right away through the line. When we bring all these players together, we create what I like to call constructive value, which suggests that when you add 1 + 1, you get something which is slightly greater than 2. And the only way to achieve this is by partnering together across sectors and sometimes even across platforms. So what are we at Safaricom doing about all of this? In 2016, we started the process of integrating 9 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals into our core business strategy. We did this because we believe that the SDGs provide the opportunities to really engage in a purpose-driven business, a business that is both sustainable and inclusive. We asked ourselves, what business could we do in the SDGs that would help us to drive inclusive growth? Our 9 priority goals are the goals in health, in education, affordable clean energy, decent work and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reducing inequalities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, peace and justice, and of course what I consider to be one of the most important goals, and that is partnerships, goal number 17. We have since then registered a significant impact in transformation through our products in health, in education, in agriculture. Our advocacy and partnerships, of which the sponsorship of this summit is one of them, is now beginning to show some good results. We're advocating around anti-corruption. We're advocating around transparency in taxes. We're advocating around child rights. We're advocating around human rights. What business is it of business to be involved in human rights? We are committed to becoming a net zero carbon emitting company by 2050. And trust me, that's not an easy commitment, because year on year our carbon footprint has been increasing over the past few years. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, Mark Kramer will talk about shared value, but unless we can address the context within which businesses operate today, it will be an uphill task to deliver sustainable shared value. We must all rethink our business models and strategies and see how to address growing inequalities. I look forward to hearing about how we can create constructive value across sectors that are very important to our continent: health, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, with a view to ensure that we can drive inclusive growth that bridges the gaps and helps bring down the walls that currently divide our population. I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.